Hi, in this episode of Things That Matter, I interview Lance Ralston, and we're talking about church history, and we're talking about his great podcast, Communio Sanctorum, the history of the church. You won't want to miss it. Stay tuned. Hi, and welcome to this episode of Things That Matter. I'm Brian Brodersen, and it's great to be with you today. And I'm excited to have with me today as my guest, Pastor Lance Ralston. Lance is the pastor of Calvary Chapel in Oxnard, California, and he is also the author of the podcast,
Communio Sanctorum, History of the Christian Church.
Yes, and that's really the thing that we're going to talk about today. Lance, thanks for being here.
Good to be here, Brian.
All right. So I heard about your podcast, a couple years back, and I'm a big, history fan and church history fan as well. And I thought, reading church history is, of course, it takes a lot of time to, wade through all these books and stuff. And I thought, what a great idea to have a podcast, where you can actually just sort of do a bunch of other things and still, get the education at the same time. So I'm excited to have you on to talk about the podcast. I've been listening to your podcast recently, and I've really been enjoying it. I want to go back and, I want to start at the very beginning and go through the whole 150.
Best way to do it.
Yeah, that's what I'm going to do. But I wanted to talk about a few things, and I wanted to start with talking about just, your interest. I mean, you're a pastor, you're a Bible teacher, and I think all of us who teach the Bible, to some extent, obviously, we overlap with church history. We're actually living church history.
We are,
right?
Indeed.
But not everybody has the same sort of passion or perspective on where a knowledge of church history might fit into ministry. So how did you get interested in this?
History is not boring. History teachers are boring.
Yeah.
History is fascinating.
It is fascinating.
You have to work at history to make it boring.
Yeah.
Some years ago, I stumbled on the genius of podcasting. Just how fun it is that you can listen to these programs that will educate you on different subjects. And I listened to a history podcast called The History of Rome by Mike Duncan. And it was one of the very first, amateur with a microphone and a computer. And it was outstanding. The thing that made it really able to connect with it was they were short.
Yeah.
And he would just share his love of what he was learning. You could tell he was learning just a bit ahead of what he was sharing on the podcast. And they were 15 to 20 minutes, sometimes maybe 30-minute episodes. Exactly the right kind of length when you're doing house chores, when you're driving to work or working out. And I listened to his whole series of over 200 episodes on the history of Rome. I was fascinated, got done with that, and I said, well, I want more history. And I'm a pastor, I love the subject of church history, so I went looking for the same kind of thing. Nothing. There were long lectures, hour-long, typically classroom recorded lectures that were rather dry and boring.
Yeah.
And so I thought, well, Mike Duncan did what he did as an amateur with a microphone and a computer. I'll do that. Yeah. So I just started studying church history on my own, writing my own scripts, bought a microphone, plugged it into my computer, and just went for it. And here we are.
Yeah, that's great. How long ago was that?
That was in 2012, so 5 years ago.
5 years ago, okay. So, but did you have, so what kind of stirred your interest in history in general? Did you study history in college, or did you, or are you just a guy that just, I'm just interested in things that happened in the past?
Yeah, great question. Reading historical novels is really how I got into history. I was reading some novels that were based in a historical setting, but then with fictional characters, or taking a historical character but telling a fictional story with them included in it. And I thought, why am I reading fiction about real things? Why not read the real things? Yeah. And if you start reading history, you realize very quickly there are some authors that take just the plain history but make it fascinating, and others that, again, they make it boring. So you have to be selective. Yeah. And but that's what really gripped my attention was historical fiction, and then the realization I could actually be reading the real story rather than these novels. Yeah. And as I began to read good history, I realized that's even way better than the novels.
Yeah, that's so true. Yeah, and me too. I just, there's so many fascinating aspects of I think just history in general. I
Yeah.
mean, obviously there are certain places and times are going to be more interesting to people depending on their own preference. But I find that, it's funny because I find I'm not so interested in the present, like the news and everything. I'm kind of like, yeah, who cares about that? I'd rather go dive into, something from hundreds of years ago, or maybe even, I just recently read, and perhaps you've read this book, it's called Jerusalem, a Biography. It's by Simon Montefiore, and it's the history of Jerusalem, the entire history of Jerusalem, from the very earliest mentioning of it in history right up to, he stopped in 1967. But it's riveting. It's just like, I couldn't put it down. It's like watching a great, like a TV series like NCIS or 24 or something.
It is.
That,
Each chapter kind of ends on a cliffhanger, so I can't wait to get to the next chapter. It's 3:00. I have to go to sleep.
Yeah. But you know what I like too, and you said it. I listened to one of your podcasts today, and I have to admit, when I saw that it was 9 minutes, I was like, 9 minutes? Now that's a little short. So I like the 14-minute one or the 17-minute ones. But then later on, I was flipping around on Twitter, and I found another podcast that I wanted to listen to. And as I looked at it, it was like 110 minutes. I was like, okay, 110 minutes. There's no way I'm listening to 110 minutes. So I like this. I think there's some wisdom there in these more brief kinds of things, because they capture you, they hold your attention. And then they leave you wanting the next episode.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
That's great. So, couple of your favorite moments in church history, or what period? Let me ask you this first. What period in church history do you find that you're most fascinated by?
Oh, wow.
And let me say this. Let me say this too, because in some people's minds. Intentional or unintentional, it's almost like, the church began with Jesus and the apostles, and then came along Martin Luther and John Calvin and the Reformers, and then we got to where we are today. And there's this whole period from, 2nd century through to the 14th century that a lot of times it just completely, people are oblivious to what happened there.
Exactly. I would have to say, if I have to narrow it down, probably the Reformation era, although I'm also fascinated by that 4th and 5th century, as the church was wrestling with how do we articulate what we believe about Jesus and the Godhead. I mean, that period of history, the period of what we call the creeds and the councils, it's a fascinating period of church history, and I think most Christians are totally oblivious to what took place.
Yeah.
And yet what we believe today was the work of 200 years of blood, sweat, and tears. I mean, there were some of the councils, they actually came to physical blows with each other over politics on the issue. And so it's a fascinating period of church history, but we're able to say what we believe today with such confidence and clarity because it took the church 200 years to wrestle with how do we articulate what we believe the Bible says about the Trinity and about Jesus being both God and man.
Yeah. This is going to be subjective, but you said something the other day in one of the podcasts I was listening to that I thought was really interesting. You were talking about Gnosticism and kind of the rise of Gnosticism and how this became in many ways kind of a dominant view in the period. But you connected that back to the fact that the church did not really it hadn't really established its clear doctrinal positions. And so these Gnostics came in with all of these, crazy theories, and there wasn't a whole lot around to say, no, that's not, look, right here it says this. That was an interesting point.
The Gnostics came and said, Jesus is this, and the church leaders had to stop and say, no, he's not. And then, well, what is he? Well, then they had to go back to the Word and begin to pull out, well, here's what the Bible, here's what Scripture says. And again, we say that so quickly. If a cult member comes to our door and wants to say that Jesus is not God, I mean, we have our points. We can argue with them. We don't realize that it was the hard labor of many years of those brilliant men articulating that position for us
Yeah.
and handing it to us.
Yeah.
So to be ignorant of church history is really, I'm concerned that nothing's new. Those old lies are going to come back.
Yeah.
And if we disregard church history, we've lost this heritage of of knowing how to be able to clearly refute this, because Christianity won. Gnosticism is no more.
Yeah.
Although it's resurging. Why? Because the church has lost its grip on its history.
Yeah, and I want to come back around to that, the relevance of church history for us today, especially for pastors and teachers. But okay, so 4th and 5th century, fascinating. Reformation, the Reformation, the period itself is so fascinating. I mean, this is where like the written histories that I've read over the years, they are riveting. I remember years and years ago, I was living in England at the time, and I came across a 2-volume set that was pulled out of Daubigny's Reformation, but it was the 2 volumes that dealt with the English Reformation. And this was like, I mean, I was up till 4 or 5 in the morning. I just could not put it down, just reading this history. So, I mean, we're 500-year anniversary of the Reformation.
This year.
This year, yeah. So just touch on the Reformation for a minute.
Well, I'm mindful of an event that occurred a couple years ago. I was with David Guzik on a Reformation tour. We were in the city of Prague. It began in Prague. And we were visiting what's called Bethlehem Chapel. It is where a man by the name of John Hus, was a Catholic priest serving in the church there in Prague. And in his studies, he began to realize that the church had gone very far from what Scripture taught. We think of the Reformation as a beginning in 1517 with Luther nailing his theses on the castle church door at Wittenberg. We were not aware that there had really been for almost 200 years a movement in the church to reform it. There was a widespread recognition on part of a lot of people, including a lot of priests, that the church had gone way off the rails. Yeah. And there was different attempts to bring reform. 100 years before Martin Luther in the city of Prague, there's this priest who begins to realize that the church had gone way off track, that people did not know what the Scriptures taught. And so he went to a local community hall. It was just a meeting hall, it was not the church. And he began just teaching a Bible study. A few people showed up, then more people came, and more people came. We were in this place now called Bethlehem Chapel a couple years ago on this tour with David Guzik, and our tour guide got up and shared about Jan Hus and 100 years before Luther, and what he did in teaching the Bible, and how eventually the place packed out. And more people were coming to hear the Bible taught than were going to the Catholic Church. And the authorities began to get involved, and their lives were being transformed. It was genuine revival that was taking place. It wasn't just that they liked going to Bible study. They were taking it out of that building. They were living it, and it was transforming their lives. And they were beginning to ask questions like, if the Bible teaches this, why is the church calling us to do this and believe this? And as I was listening to our guide, I raised my hand, and something occurred to me. Brian, you might appreciate this. I raised my hand, and she finished, and she said, "Sure, come on up." And so I got up, and I paused, and I said, think about what happened in this room. Really, in many ways, what we're a part of, it was a Calvary Chapel tour, what we're a part of, Calvary Chapel, what we're known for is teaching the Bible verse by verse, simply teaching the Bible simply. In many ways, what we are was birthed in this very room right here.
That's amazing.
And we all kind of got chills.
Yeah.
Bethlehem Chapel really was kind of the cradle, many steps in between, many steps.
Yeah.
But what Jan Hus did in that room in getting back to the Bible and simply teaching the Bible simply transformed the community of Christ there in Prague, and that did have a profound impact on Luther. It was 100 years later, but that stream continued. That idea of teaching the Bible eventually got to Luther, and then moved him, and here we are today.
Yeah, I read a biography on Luther years ago, and there was something that was said that just struck me, and it stuck with me all these years. But it said that in Luther's day, he emerged onto the scene as a master of the biblical text, there was no one in Luther's day that actually really even knew the Bible. His primary theological instructor had never even read the scriptures.
No.
He'd read everything but the Bible. And, so Luther comes out as this, and, Luther obviously had a lot of other issues and problems.
Yes, he did.
But he got this one thing right.
Yes.
That the importance, the authority of Scripture.
Yes, he did.
Yeah, so amazing. Now, this is where I want to talk, finally, as we kind of wind things down, about the relevance of church history for us today. And I think it is extremely relevant. I was listening again to one of your podcasts the other day, and you were talking about the rise of dualism. And how dualism, all of these centuries ago, how this sort of emerged, as kind of the view that a lot of people were attracted to, but how even though we wouldn't identify it today as dualism so much, unless you know about that, this is very much being communicated in our culture today, especially through our entertainment, through our films, novels, all of that kind of stuff. So what I want to talk about here is just the relevance, there's nothing new under the sun, right?
Nothing new.
And these things that come along today, we think, oh my gosh, this has never happened before. We'd never heard of anything like this. If you go back far enough, you'll find that, oh no, it happened before.
Yes.
And this is, what it was then, and this is how they dealt with it then. And so
it's of great value for us to understand church history. And I would encourage all pastors and Bible teachers to begin an investigation of church history, because what we will face and what the issues that we deal with, and so many, again, of the beliefs that we hold today with such confidence, were hammered out over time, and oftentimes, Brian, against the backdrop of controversy. Someone came with a false teaching, and the church was put in a position of having to clarify what it believed. And so many of the things that the church is dealing with even today are issues the church has dealt with in the past. And we deny ourselves a great resource by not going back and taking a look at what the great thinkers and believers of the past have said and done about these things.
Yeah. Is there, besides your own podcast, what's a good, I looked in your bibliography there as well, and I knew a number of those different books that you use as resources. Is there one, or are there maybe a couple of church history volumes that you think this is indispensable? This people have got to read this.
The one book that I would encourage, and I have repeatedly, anyone to read that might be interested in being interested in church history, Church History in Plain Language by Bruce Shelley. It's written in an extremely engaging format. It's written like stories. And he gets to the history, wonderful book. Wonderful book.
Yeah, I've read the book. Yeah, it's a good book. But just give the audience a little bit more information about the podcast itself. How to access it, how to approach it, how to utilize it.
We come out with a new episode every Sunday morning. They're typically between 15 and 20 minutes long. Some episodes a little bit longer, some a little bit shorter, depending on the subject matter. There's 150 episodes of a survey of church history. I took a break, and now we're doing what I call season 2, where we're going in-depth short series on different topics. And so that's what we're doing right now. It can be accessed via Sanctorum.us. I got the name for the podcast from Dietrich Bonhoeffer's dissertation.
Okay, right.
He wrote Sanctorum Communio, actually, is what he called it, the communion of saints.
Right.
And so I call it Communio Sanctorum. But on iTunes, that means nothing on iTunes, so it's called History of the Christian Church, the podcast. And you can access it on the Sanctorum.us website or through iTunes Store, and it's also on a number of podcast feeds. If you just do a search on Google for History of the Christian Church, Communio Sanctorum, you'll find it.
Yeah. Great. Now, one last thing. You commented in one of the recent episodes about, kind of the broad audience of people that are listening to you, and you talked about the fact that you have agnostics, you have atheists. Most people are very cordial and, thankful for the podcast, even those, that would be identifying as unbelievers. But you did mention that you get a few cranky sort of atheists or whatever that are taking a few shots at you occasionally.
Yes, I try to be unbiased, which, no one's completely unbiased. And there are times I offer my opinion. I try to give a verbal parenthesis by saying, this is my opinion now. And but I try to be as even-handed with the material as I can be. And as a consequence of that, because I'm not speaking against different things at different times, I've had numerous people, far more believers than unbelievers, say, you are a Calvinist, you are an Arminianist, you are this, you are that, which, because I'm not speaking against what they think I should be speaking against. Not what I'm not speaking for what they think I should be. It's what, you need to be speaking more against this. Obviously you're this. I've been accused of being a Roman Catholic. Because I haven't
You're
been
being a good journalist.
I'm trying to be. I'm trying to be. Well, that's what so frosts me about so much of the reporting of the news today, is that it is so biased. In my podcast, I try to be as unbiased as I can be. I've received criticism from those that want me to slant it more in a particular direction. And I have to be frank, I appreciate those because it lets me know I'm doing it the way I want to do it.
Yeah, good. So you started with season 1. You start with the Book of Acts. Is that where you start?
Yes.
Okay. And then where do you stop?
About the early 19th century. Okay. At that point, there are just so many denominations and movements that it would become impossible to track them all. And so I stopped.
Okay.
Mid-18th, beginning of the 19th century is where I stop. And then I encourage those that are subscribers that want more to say, you get a microphone, you plug it into your computer, and you take it from there with the group that you're interested in.
Yeah. So with season 2, and we're wrapping things up here, but with season 2, now you said you kind of did a broad overview in season 1. Mm-hmm. Now you're kind of going in and filling in some of the blanks.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And so I did a short series on the first centuries with a more in-depth look at what the church was doing and wrestling with during that time. We did a short series on the creeds and the councils, those councils that were hammering out the early issues of the church. What do we believe? And here's how we're going to say it. So important. And then right now we're in a series on heretics and heresies.
Right, yeah. Okay. That's where I'm at. I'm listening to that right now.
Go back and start with season 1.
I'm going to make my way back there. Lance, thanks so much.
It was great being here.
Yeah, great having you. And thanks for joining us for this episode today. And I just want to encourage you. This is a fantastic podcast that Lance has produced. And if you're interested in history, this would be something fantastic for you to engage with. And even if maybe you haven't been so interested in church history, it's a fascinating study and it's important as well. So I want to encourage you to check out the podcast and engage with that. So God bless, and see you next time.